So good evening. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. My name is Paul Fonsale. I'm one of the co-founders of the Conduit, and I'm delighted that you have assembled here today to talk about the broad topic of refugees and the specific topic of Ukraine. I'm excited to sort of say a few introductory words for two reasons. One is because TED conferences that you all know have a kind of tagline, which is ideas worth spreading. And I think today's event is demonstration of the fact that at the Conduit, there are also ideas that are worth doing. And I mean that because the work that we have done, and Nick Vetch, who is on our board and just a really remarkable person who kind of gets things done, has done, was catalyzed from an event that happened at the Conduit, talking about Ukraine and the conflict in Ukraine and focusing on the plight of people who are fleeing that conflict to find safer shores and places of refuge. And from that rather descriptive event, a place where we shared ideas, a whole series of really profound actions ensued that I think really made a material difference to the lives of many people. And I think if you were to think of a reason why we set up the Conduit, was to do exactly that. Initiate conversations, catalyze, present ideas, and then catalyze real action that makes a real difference. And tonight's event is, as you will hear, a really powerful illustration of that. The second point is that anybody who thinks that the movement of people across borders is going to be occasional and episodic hasn't been paying attention. That whether it's due to conflict or climate or inequality or malgovernance, we are going to see a movement of people across borders that will dwarf anything that we have ever seen before. It is going to be a feature, not a bug, of global existence. And therefore, how we manage that phenomenon is going to say a great deal about who we are as people and countries, as societies, as the people who are the recipients of people who move. And we really have two very simple choices, I would suggest to you. We can blame those people. We can regard them as the enemy or as threats or as burdens. And we can assume a set of policies and politics which starts from that premise and utilizes those people for our political advantage. Or we can say that the reason why those people are coming is, broadly speaking, not anything to do with their own personal culpability. It is a set of circumstances that have been foisted upon them. And we can start thinking of those people not as burdens, but as benefits, not as liabilities, but as assets. And I think what we've done tonight and what you'll hear about is a proper conception of recasting how we think about people who land up in the shores of countries that are generally wealthy and generally stable. And I think it's the beginning of a conversation, because what I hope you will see here at the Conduit over the next year is a series of both programs and talks and events which takes what we've started in Ukraine and tries to do something much more imaginative and ambitious. Not that this wasn't either imaginative or ambitious, I hasten to add, but takes those learnings from what we have done in Ukraine and tries to do things which really focuses on the settlement and integration of refugees in wealthy, stable societies, and which utilizes people for their true human potential. So it's the beginning of a conversation, and I'm very delighted to be able to invite you all and welcome you here. I think now we're going to do a film screening for 10, 11 minutes, and then Nick Vetch is going to come up and chair the session and introduce the panel. So the screening now begins.
Проверка звука.
Сідай до мене на ручки. Анютка, дивись.
Мяу.
Не треба м'явкати зараз. Сідай отак. Отут, так? Угу. Нормально сідай.
Ja.
I spent 16 hours on the floor of a train with my cat on my legs. On every station it was really dangerous because we thought that Russian maybe just pull bombs on us. We spent 2 days on the border. It was a huge queue. And only here in Poland he finally could eat something good.
I've been in Mariupol. I've been there. I mean, I lived really close to all this. It's really a touristical place where you go, like when you wanna go to the sea, like with friends. Not anymore. No, I can't even imagine it. No building left. Everything destroyed. I can't. That's absolutely like possible.
Мріємо, щоб був швидше мир. У нас на Україні, і щоб цієї війни не було. Хочеться додому, тому що сім'я залишилась вдома. Дочка, внук, чоловік. А ми тут хочемо дуже миру.
Рядом попала ракета в дом, рядом с моим домом. В наших домах вылетели все окна, вот, а тот дом горел. И люди кричали: спасите, помогите. Это было все на глазах. Они прыгали с окон, с 9-этажных.
Прикрывались нами как живым щитом. Дети были без еды, без воды, без ничего, никакой помощи, ничего не было.
Мы планировали через несколько дней выехать, но сестра мне позвонила, говорит: Настя, есть свободные места в автобусе, надо срочно выезжать. Мы сели в этот автобус и уехали. И когда мы сюда приехали, мы узнали, что в Краматорске был прилет, и именно тогда, когда мы должны были уезжать тем эвакуационным поездом. И вы знаете, там было очень много жертв, и дети, и люди. Она мне плачет тоже сквозь слезы, говорит мне: Настя, мы пролежали сутки в подвале под завалами. Соседям не разрешали нас откапывать. Ну, мы как бы, ну, представьте, мы с ним 18 лет вместе, с 18 лет, ну, уже 17-й год пошел. Это моя первая любовь, наверное, единственная. И, наверное, так точно и есть.
Спасибо
Мы победим. Можно я вас обниму? Спасибо большое. Встретить родную душу Донецкого региона.
Определенно, то же самое я.
Navigate asking the woman from Mariupol.
Well, she was really quite not that open.
She was not, okay.
Yeah, and I never ask this kind of question. If they want to go this direction, they will, and they did. Some of them did by themselves. I won't ask about was it hard. Of course, it was hard. I don't wanna.
Silly question to ask.
I don't wanna her re-traumatize, re-experience that.
Yeah.
That would be horrible. I think maybe I should take my passport with me. Having Ukrainian passport. So I don't know. So, that's fine. So should I like pretend that you're not with me, or should I talk to you?
Yeah, pretend I'm not.
Okay, I will. But don't get offended by that. I'm pretending you're not. I'm sorry. Yes. Get in touch online.
Yeah.
Please rest more.
Yeah.
Please.
I'll try to.
Well, we will call and check it every time. Yeah.
А як ти думаєш, це добре, що в тебе є друзі? Чим друзі можуть тобі? Чим хорошо, що в тебе є друзі?
Тим, що вона може допомогти.
А що в тебе трапилось? Чим вони можуть тобі допомогти?
Щоб я не був один.
А ти відчуваєш себе одним тут?
Ні.
У тебе залишились в Україні друзі? Ти за ними скучаєш? Угу. А хто там твій найкращий друг в Україні, який залишився? Нітко, стань.
У мене всі кращі друзі.
Угу. Я зрозуміла. I have never thought that children are so strong. I think that they are okay because they are with the mom, but they want to go home very much. When I heard that the program started, I decided that it's better to go to the UK because it's a safe place for children. And when we were on the way to this place, my son, he said, "Mom, you see, the sky is so blue and the field is so yellow. And here it's not, it's something special because England is a very green country." And I asked my friend to stop. And when he stopped, we saw that it was a wheat field. And you couldn't imagine, we stopped and we were like, we started crying. It was very difficult because it's something like it's Ukrainian because it's a flag of Ukraine, blue and yellow. And now we have some weeds in our home from this field.
Давай вдвох побіжимо. Давай. Давай. І будеш бігти до мене? Давай. Давай, Аня. 3, 2, 1. Робиш? Ні. Ти рада? Ага. А ти бачиш там школа? Отам твоя школа.
Ага.
Там ти займаєшся, так?
Маленька.
Угу. А де велика школа?
В Києві.
В Києві?
І в Польщі.
Ага. А в Києві? А в Києві в тебе є якісь найкращі друзі, за ким ти сумуєш?
Ні.
За ким сумуєш найбільше?
За папою.
За папою?
Ну, де вони?
Папа найбільший друг?
3, 2, 1, пішла!
Тебе люблю. Тебе люблю. Чуєш, кажу?
Що?
Люблю тебе.
Я тебе дуже цілосно обізянка.
Яка твоя найбільша мрія?
Поїхати в Київ.
До кого?
До папи.
До папи? You understand children, they feel more convenient to be with mom, so they feel safe place. So they are with me.
A lot of people now trying to find another place to live. It's second wave and it's not the last one. And it is just really heartbreaking to think about it because it's hard to keep it on the news. It's hard to keep it like on the surface. Like coming over to us, just checking up on us, just asking us for like whether we want to join them for the dinner and all this stuff. And honestly, I think I just in love with the neighborhood. It's so beautiful, calm, and I just love it. And it's so something doesn't look like Ukrainian like regular street, not in bad sense, but like it's so different. We don't have this kind of homes standing like this. Not only for applicant is going to be really, it should be really comfortable, but also for a sponsor as well. I know so many brilliant people who really put a lot of effort in this process. Yeah, start to help them. A lot of sponsors. We have so many people, so many Ukrainians who getting back to us saying that they absolutely shocked of how much of support they're getting from hosts, their sponsors. Like they were saying, we didn't even write, but people already asked the job center what they can find for me, and they already asked the school if there's a place for my daughter. Being here, it is really, really nice, and it feels so much safer than not knowing what to do and where to go. Back in Poland, it was all like from place to place, from apartment to apartment, trying to find some place to stick with and kind of live there for a couple nights and then trying to find another place. Another thing what I thought about living in London, what I sometimes think about people who came from occupied territory or just dangerous territory or like severely damaged territory, and there is a lot of planes here. Sometimes I think it might be hard for other people. We need to understand that the majority of the people who are arriving to the UK, it's women and with the children. So it's quite vulnerable people who travel from the country which is in a state of war right now. They could be traumatized, they could be exhausted. So I think the ideal type of sponsor is the person who can accept that, who can support, who can give them space. That is really, really nice. It was really nice because it's also Ukrainians colors, and they just drove by to give it to us. I have a flag right here. You know, I always carry it with me. When it was close to Independence Day, I asked them whether we can hang it anywhere, like somewhere, maybe outside of the house, maybe on the wall. And then that's how they knew that that's going to be Independence Day. Then they give it that to us. That's really, really nice. Really warm. Our absolutely beautiful flag. This one with me, it's pretty big though, but we put there not only mine stuff, but also my sister's stuff, so it's like that. I think that's all what I have right now. And it's not like too little, but yeah, at least as I said before, just a place to relax, to be welcomed, not to be in chaos and constant worry what I'm going to do next, at least for a couple months. This is such a big, vital thing for so many Ukrainians right now.
Just me. I'm on my own. Good. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. I won't do long introductions because it's all there in the flyer, but the star of our show, Anastasia, who neither of us can quite remember how we met, but it was somewhere on a very, very crowded, very chaotic railway station in Krakow, and there was Anastasia helping a Swede and a Norwegian, I think, bussing out Ukrainians to, we don't know where really, do we? Anyway, we said to her, come and work for us, and she did. And so she's been with us all the way through the journey. Richard Harrington, who needs no introduction, was a refugee minister and a businessman before that. And I have to say, has been a very important part of our process. Not least of all, it was absolutely essential that when we set up this charity USP UK that we got charitable status. And he and Paul Morrison, who are here, were instrumental in getting us charitable status in 8 days. 8 days. Normally it takes 8 months. And I can tell you that now, it would not have been possible without it. Jen Bond, who I met a bit over a year ago, and I remember sitting here with her and going, Jen, I have absolutely no idea about any of this, but you're going to help me sort it out. And so she was a very, very important part in giving us and me confidence to get going with this endeavour. And Tim, who has spent his working life in this space and has made a great deal of difference to many people's lives. And I read his and Maureen Commons' papers avidly because it gives us a very good sense of direction as to where we should be going and how other people are thinking about the reception of refugees into this country. So we're just going to start. I've got 4 prepared questions, and then we're going to wing it because I'm too lazy to prepare any more. But actually, I hope this will develop into a conversation rather than a sort of stilted set of questions from me. I'm going to start with Anastasia because you were on the film. So one of the things that has struck me in the short time that I've been involved in this space is about how little agency we give to refugees. So that's to some degree understandable because very often it's in crisis or in emergency. But we do shunt them around and we don't necessarily take much account of their preferences. And the focus is on some of the basics, housing, water, food. Can you just tell us what this feels like sometimes and what your journey's been on this and what do we need to look out for in that regard?
Is it working? Yeah. Okay, good. It's a really good question. I guess the situation is that sorry, I forgot to tell that I'm really honored to be here. Thank you so much, everyone, to be here. And because first support Ukraine I think the situation is when someone is such a dangerous situation and when something life-threatening is happening to the person and another person have an opportunity and see a chance to help, it's easy to kind of overlook that usually when you help in person, finding, for example, accommodation, and as you said, helping them to fulfill and kind of satisfy their basic needs, it is not all what person need for kind of fulfilled, happy life. And when we talk about helping refugees, talk about helping only their physical and like basic needs, and we're not really talking about helping, kind of not really helping, but just leave them be and be active, proactive, doing what they want to do. When we're not giving them that chance, when we think that help is just this bare minimum that we can give. But in reality, when you on another side, when you're the one who needs help, it's really hard to, when you get that support, it's really hard to open and thrive. It's really hard to start see yourself as a victim if everyone sees you as a victim and not anything else. So when we're talking about like a complex support, it's have to also include kind of when you care about the independence and dignity of the refugees coming here.
Thank you. Jen, just following that theme on, when does a refugee stop being a refugee?
Well, there's a legal answer to that, which I'm going to avoid. Hopefully there's nobody here checking my legal credentials. Because I think that the more important answer is actually a human one, which is to say the label is stigmatizing as soon as we apply it. And I think it creates barriers and a sense of victimization. We have operated for many, many years systems, both globally and domestically, that are heavily managed systems. And through those processes, we've really focused on the victimization, the needs, we tend to absorb a sense of responsibility that has crossed over and become very disempowering. So our systems, I think, actually create challenges for refugees the moment we apply the label, and many people continue to wear that label for their entire lives. I find it very interesting, people who have lived for a long time in their new host communities. They're very successful, they thrive, they may have been here for decades, multi-generational, and they'll still be very shy, very cautious about using the word refugee to identify their own story. And I think we have to really respect that choice and understand the power and the harm that that word causes for a lot of people.
Thank you. I'm just going to preempt this. So I would like to turn this into a conversation after I've asked you all. So if you know, we're all here, so think of some questions. Tim, you've done a huge amount of work on the response from communities to the arrival of refugees, and sometimes to the integration, sometimes not. I read a lot of your papers, so what can we learn from this, and what are the benefits, and how do we change the narrative around this so that it's a positive narrative, and make people understand that these can be very productive members of society, these being refugees, and actually become citizens? How do we do that?
Well, I think one thing that's, against the backdrop of a horrible war and, the brutal act of the invasion by Putin's regime, we have a really positive story in what's been achieved in the UK, and in fact in many other countries as well. So I think the most recent number is about 117,000 Ukrainians welcomed under the Homes for Ukraine scheme. And the idea that British families would host that number of people fleeing violence, if you were to say that 2 years ago, it would have been unimaginable, absolutely unimaginable. People wouldn't have believed it possible, and yet it's been done. And second, it's been very successful. I mean, you can fault many things in the program. I mean, it's a new thing, it's like, I was thinking today, if you were to ask what's the future of the motor car 100 years ago, there was only 200,000 cars being produced in the country, you would have said, well, they're very difficult and they do these and they run over people, whatever, but imagine how the world got changed by the motor car. Well, this is like that. This is a new scheme that's come together in such a short period of time. It's got a ton of problems. And, we've recently done research on this, and, people say, only 15% of people are happy with how much information they got from the government when they were hosts. And, there's various different things. But the most important thing is 88% say they'd do it all over again. And many of them talk in very powerful terms about it being one of the greatest experiences of their lives. And it's tough to open up your home and welcome someone into your home, and with this, open-ended commitment people have often been making, and there's cultural differences, there's the trauma of war that people are experiencing, but despite all of that, you've got this incredibly positive story from hosts. And I think the third thing, thinking looking out to society, there is something permanent to be built on the foundation of Homes for Ukraine, and that is that shifting towards a more community-based form of welcome rather than one that's so centred on government and on big agencies just makes a lot of sense. There is huge civic energy to be harnessed. Brits are really welcoming people, and keen to be welcomers to people who they know need help. You get belonging, you get community, you get better integration. But also really interestingly, and this is something we've tracked we've got teams in the US and in Germany here, and a couple of other countries too, but in those three countries we have found that universally, if you frame the story of opening the country to welcoming refugees through the lens of community sponsorship, you get significant increases in public support for the policy of welcoming refugees. So the most recent thing we did in November in the UK showed, we asked a question about welcoming more refugees on top of the significant numbers recently, and the overall position was almost the same, pro and con. So 43% yes, we should have more, 46% against. When we say through the lens of community sponsorship, we should welcome people through, we'll just describe it in a couple of sentences, the numbers change to 55 to 32. So you get a 26-point shift in the level of public support. Same deal in the US, same deal in Germany, different numbers, but generally it's around about 10 to 15% increase in support. And also one thing which is really interesting is a significant reduction in opposition. So people's anxiety about welcoming refugees is often actually to do with, do they fit in? Does it work? Do we have the housing? Can we do the right thing by people coming in? And there's such reassurance when the public sees a community-based welcome that really shifts. So I think there's something really positive for the long term to build out of this foundation as well.
Thank you. I want to come back to that because just to see what we can apply going forwards from what we've learned from Homes for Coon. But just before we go there, Richard, you've been at the heart of government and you're not at the heart of government, so I hope you can speak to some degree freely.
I did when I was at the heart of government.
You did actually, yeah, very fair, very fair. So the government, I mean, it's not a specific comment about its response to a refugee crisis, but generally governments very often have to respond to emergencies and crises. So it has done so in spades. It opened up in regard to the Homes for Ukraine scheme, open up space for civic society and civic society to respond to that. How much cognizance does it have around the real integration rather than just providing shelter and water? How much real forward thinking is it able to do, given all the other things going on?
Not enough, really, but in the end, the governments, I think I was speaking to Paul before about this, governments do good, but the governments work better in emergency than they do in normal times. Now, the emergency was, without warning, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, and like had happened in Syria, like had happened in Afghanistan, the British government and many governments across the world had not a plan in place to deal with the flow of distraught and displaced human beings. Now, for me, I think my aim is, I hope everybody in this room, and certainly on this panel, that this does not happen again, and that a system of sponsorship is not a short-term expediency to deal with a crisis, because unfortunately there's always a crisis, but there's a proper machinery in place to deal with whatever misery there is in the world, and politicians in each country have to decide, can't say that is their elected responsibility to decide how many people that they wish to take. I wish they'd all do it internationally and do it in a coordinated way. But so the real thing is, how do we get this system? And this system came because Boris Johnson made his usual unthought out pledge, in this way, in a good way, about we're taking an uncapped number of refugees. I don't criticise him for that, but no idea whatsoever where to put them. Afghanistan, the Afghan refugees had come a year before, and they were stuck in hotels against the advice of myself and others who'd been involved in the Syrian program in 2015, or whenever it was. And I just hope it doesn't happen again. I hope government, which has shown, and I think the real thing is here, you mentioned before, Tim, about central government and communities. Well, I think with the Homes for Ukraine scheme, it's actually quite a hybrid. Because, yes, the communities came forward, and the brilliant thing is, they talk about the British class system and all this sort of stuff. It's basically everybody. People from, like, the poshest village in the leafiest Tory area of southern England to, big cities and places in really quite poor areas of the country. And this was nothing to do with, that lot up north, they can take refugees. It was brilliant all round, but it was a mixture because the government, under the scheme that we had, and Paul Morrison, Tory Pecker here, who worked very closely with it, and other members of our task force, they showed that we can, using the local authorities, to provide what we call the wraparound services, which were, in many cases, yes, doctors, like it said in the film, schools, doctors, and, help checking out the sponsors, because we didn't know who they were. We didn't know if they were criminal traffickers, paedophiles, or financial scammers that didn't have proper accommodation, all sorts of stuff. We had to use a distribution mechanism of local government. We couldn't just say, community, we're leaving it to you. And the government also put its money where it did, quite rightly. But so I do think it has to be a partnership. Similarly, the civic society element of it, which was very considerable here, and also thanks to you, Nick, and others, in Poland and other countries, as we saw and as your experiences were, Anastasia, that that probably was not. You see, I was wrong on this. Paul Morrison, who's here, who's our main civil servant, who had helped so much with the Syrian scheme, who I managed to extract back into the refugee world because, like all good civil servants, had been promoted to do a job that was nothing whatsoever to do with his experience. Thank you for coming back, Paul. But I basically thought, in the end, we were going to have to government would have to get involved to do the bit from Poland and Lithuania and Latvia and the other places. And Paul said he bet his mortgage that the system we'd put in place with, well, basically with the matching service would work. Of course, he was right, and I was wrong. And I'm delighted to be wrong on that because it shows that civic society does throw up systems, and I was completely wrong on that. But the main thing is, if I just walk away from here today and everything, and I'm not involved in the government now, this has got to be permanent. This system, and it can be improved. I mean, I believe, for example, that for the long term, which you mentioned in your question, Nick, I know I'm being a bit of a politician, kind of waffling around, but I think that we have to also have group community schemes, which they have in other countries. Groups of churches, or it doesn't really matter what they are, a village or a school group who take responsibility for a group of refugees or displaced people. Because I think the problem with using the word refugees, we come into the legal definitions and other things, which is irrelevant to how people feel. And in fact, the Ukrainian government got very cross with us by calling people refugees, because displaced people. And it is true, the people from Syria were proper refugees. The last thing they wanted to do in the world was to go back to Syria because they were so badly treated there, not just with the war, but for 20, 30 years or so. This is different in Ukraine, but what we call them, I think, is irrelevant. But this, and I implore the government, and I hope everyone that's got influence in the government, and I still have, and other people, and it doesn't matter which political party is there, this has to become a permanent way of dealing with displaced people. And, unfortunately, all gets drowned out with all this stuff about Rwanda and illegal this, illegal that. And politicians do play to the public. I actually think, and this is your point again, Tim, that the public are very sympathetic to this. It's weird, isn't it? They've got Linton Crosby, the great Australian election guru said that in politics, where logic and emotion meet, emotion always wins. Which Boris Johnson is very good at emotion. But just to finish on this point, in the case of, let's call them refugees for want of something else, yes, the very people that are saying, oh no, we don't want them to come here, we've got too many, we're full, and all this stuff, as soon as you show them a drowning child or something like that, oh, not them, of course, we should do everything we can to help them. And that emotional side, I think, won, and I think it will always win. Thank you. That was probably longer than you wanted.
No, it's really very helpful. So I'm going to throw this out because I'd quite like to get a conversation going rather than pretty on. So the Ukrainian crisis and the people who've come here are a very specific cohort in a sense, in that Anastasia will probably corroborate this, but tell me if I'm wrong. They essentially want to go home. So the scheme that's been set up works well. But it is a temporary scheme, and Anastasia and I were talking about this earlier. There are issues about it in the long term. There are imbalances of power between the host and the people being looked after and so on. Any of you, is this translatable into a scheme for people who are looking for long-term settlement here, or permanent settlement here?
See, I actually think so. But this isn't one size fits all. The majority of people probably not. They're quite happy for 6 months, a year, whatever it is. But if the reason I think that it could be used for longer term is because if the government are in a position, which I think they are, to say after an initial period they will give more financial help to people whose homes it is. So take, for example, what I really wanted to do, which the government to some extent have come forward, which is after 6 months to double the amount of money. Well, that can become, for some people, and this is not because they're bad people, but for the financial, people have different financial needs and everything, that it can become literally a commercial rent. I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of there. And that commercial rent may be paid for the government for a time, but when people are working, they will be able to pay it or through the benefit system. So I think, but it's not like all, just say it finishes up at 150,000. It's not like all of those people it can be turned into a permanent thing. But I see nothing wrong with it if people are having to say, well, look, now I've done my bit for the country and to help the Ukrainians, but I need a bit more money to do it. I see nothing wrong with that.
Thank you, Richard.
So Canada's been running a sponsorship program for 40 years and brings approximately 30,000 people a year in that program. It's bigger than our traditional resettlement program, and there's a long wait list. So there's a lot of sponsors very keen to participate in the program. And I've had the real privilege over the last few years, together with some colleagues, some of whom are in the room, Tim as well, and others, to try to support governments and communities in other countries to take on board the principles of sponsorship, not only in response to crises, but also to support their ongoing permanent resettlement programs. And when we sit here today, there's now 30 programs all over the world. When we started the work 6 years ago, it was actually the UK that was one of the first countries to put up their hand and say they were going to try to do something unique, built for the UK, but based a little bit on an inspiration from Canada. So it's very exciting to be here these years later, back in the UK, which I always have felt very fondly was a critical forerunner of the next generation of sponsorship. But I think when we look out now in those 30 programs, we see examples of all different kinds of policies. Some of those policies are built in response to crises, and they're the biggest programs. This one here, I have to tell you, is extraordinary. Congratulations to everyone who's been a part of it. And I want you to know that your program here directly inspired a lot of other countries in their crisis response to Ukraine. And I'll just give you the very quick example of the United States. The US has a program called Uniting for Ukraine. It looks very, very similar to Homes for Ukraine. That's not an accident. They're a few weeks behind you in announcing their program. They were watching carefully what was happening here. And a couple of the key features which the minister innovated, which together with civil society, again, some wonderful partners in the room, and average everyday Brits demonstrated could succeed, were one, the idea of a two-sided visa. So the idea that when you come to government, you have the name of both the newcomer and the sponsor already in place. And part of what that does is it takes the government out of the game of deciding who has the best kind of links to come to your country. So in the normal resettlement program, governments sit around and decide, oh, first cousins are allowed, but second cousins are not. And then they have a problem. They not only have to make that decision, they have to decide how to vet, to decide, to prove, to check that people meet that criteria. And in this case, the UK took all of that out and said, we're not going to get in the game of deciding which links we care about. We're just going to say the two-sided visa allows all of those links to be accommodated in our program. And the US stole that idea, and other countries were also really inspired by that idea. The other really big innovation that happened here is, of course, this idea of deeply empowering civil society and communities. And for me, that's at the core of sponsorship. So these 30 programs all look different, but this idea that government is in partnership with civil society and hosts are empowered to lead the welcome. That's at the heart of what a sponsorship program is. And I will say a final example here. Because the Uniting for Ukraine program in the US was so successful, and they've now welcomed almost 125,000 people, 150,000 approved to travel, and over 200,000 applications, that program has been so successful that they have now launched an exactly identical program for Venezuelans, 24,000 spots. It filled up within a few weeks. And on the heels of that success, they expanded the program to include Haitians, Cubans, Nicaraguans. 360,000 people a year can be sponsored through that program. And I want everyone in this room to feel that they had a very direct part in opening those 360,000 spaces. You did by inspiring the world through sponsorship. Nick asked the question, can it work in other contexts, in other situations? The answer is yes. We just have to keep learning together. What are the policy features that work, that don't work? How do we try to innovate? And how do we empower our communities to be at the heart of our response?
One of the interesting dimensions I reflect on, because Conduit is a a space that encourages discussion about social innovation, social enterprise. And you often have the world of policy making, like the actual sort of making of policy, is often very distant from the conversation around innovation, as if they're two separate things. And for me personally, I worked in politics for several years, I've worked in social enterprise world, and I've always thought it's odd that it's often such a divided conversation. This is a really unusual example of policy, of basically a kind of a rolling process of policy innovation over the last 7 years. And I mean, the backstory to the work Jennifer's been doing is essentially creating a modular sort of breakdown of the Canadian refugee policy that's been in place for 4 decades, and making it really easy for other governments and bureaucracies to come and adapt that to their own setting. And it was a deliberate act by the Canadian government in partnership with philanthropy to do that. And back 7 years ago, when I was co-founding More in Common, with actually Gemma Mortensen was one of our co-founders who was part of the team who set up the Conduit. When we started that work, we were really interested in the issue of refugees because we saw how refugees are being instrumentalised to divide societies, and More in Common trying to counter that, build cohesion. And I looked at the refugee policies and I thought, like, how do you change these dynamics? And my conclusion was the one positive thing that we can imagine doing in an environment where you're going to have all these populists whipping up fear is shift to a model that makes us more community-centred. Community-based, because it generates all of these positive stories. And I think in Canada, spending time in Canada, so many people have personal experience over this 40-year period. The othering of refugees is kind of much harder to do. It's really bipartisan, the support for that policy. And so seeing that now adopted in other countries, and as Jen's been describing, it's really positive. One thing that I reflect on, because we've just been doing a whole lot of focus groups with people in the UK and people in the US who've been sponsors under the different schemes, you realise how they can be structured in quite different ways. So in the US context, they're more like circles of sponsors. They generally don't physically have the refugee families in their homes. So the UK model is a little different in being so intense, actually, in people's experience of hosting, which has its pluses and minuses. But what's interesting, just listening to sponsors in America talk about their experiences, is they talk a lot about how it's been a really great experience meeting other neighbours, other people who are in that sort of sponsor group and collaborating together. And actually, to be honest, they kind of talk more about that positive experience of community with others, doing a project, doing work together, solving problems, a little bit less about the direct engagement with the refugee families. And here, people tend to talk more about that direct experience, and then they've often got like structured local organisations who might be doing a morning tea every week or some kind of activities. But anyway, it's interesting. It's a different kind of experience. I think Americans have experienced a kind of community group agency that's quite positive, and it's made them feel, actually, because things are so bad in the US, it's made them feel more positive about their country and their community, and that's a positive. But the experience here is just this more personal. So the thing is, there's many ways to adapt these schemes, and they'll have different. And I guess the point is, it's to keep on learning and create more. I think that part of the evolution is to create a scheme that isn't reliant on people being in your home, because that's quite challenging. It's quite a high barrier, and that's why I think it's so amazing that there has been 117,000 Ukrainians welcomed into people's homes. That's really quite remarkable, because it's a much tougher scheme to run than what the US has done.
Yeah, I just wanted to, while I was listening to you, what you remind me what you're saying, that's exactly what we were discussing the day we were just finding out how exactly we can help Ukrainians. Is what we wanted to do is to bring them to communities. So basically that was a core message, instead of everything what we're trying to do, we try to build the communities inside of communities and bring people there and build their kind of a system which will help them integrate there. And we already see that. So in our organization currently we have many strategic partners, like resettlement partners, like more than 30 resettlement partners. And recently we had a panel, also not panel, but basically each of the community gave a presentation of what they've been achieving, what they achieved, and like what they've been doing so far. And for me, working on the end, when I'm matching people with like Ukrainian guests, with UK hosts, I didn't really realize how major impact actually was done in the communities and like especially rural places. It makes wonders because people were connecting, working together, doing activities, and that's just exactly everything that what you just said, mentioned. It's exactly how we tried to build our organization on.
Tim, if I could just, my experience in America is probably a bit different from what you're saying and what you're saying. I may be wrong, but certainly when I did the Syrian program and went to Baltimore and other places, it was basically, you're welcome, a month, we'll help you for a month, then you're on your own. Now, I don't know if that's changed, but the State Department called it tough love as a policy. And we've not gone down that route. And I hope we don't go down that route. But they are fundamentally different, I think. And I think I'd just like to make one other point, not in rebuttal to what you said, but, talking about the policies and innovation policies are kind of treated as being separate from implementation and delivery. I mean, that is a fault of government in the UK, I suspect in other countries as well, where the smart people, the smart officials, everything's policy, 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 and the delivery stuff is kind of back office, well, they're not really as good as us. They do operations like it's a kind of secondary thing. Well, not in the task force that we put together. And I think it's a model for government where policy and implementation are treated together. And I heard that, not just for refugee policy, I do think that's a big lesson.
I'll just jump in because I just want to emphasize again how inspiring the success of the Homes for Ukraine program was in the United States, where they have had, in my view, the most traditional resettlement program in the world for decades. So going back 40 years, they also, like Canada, had a sort of sponsorships type program. They shut that down in the early 1980s, and they have run a very, very tough love, professionally delivered program for all of those 40 decades. And they started to realize the limitations of that program. One of the major limitations was people who had been there for decades had no friends. They were working, they were living their lives, they were contributing to the tax base and doing all these other things, and they had no friends. They weren't integrated into society in any meaningful way. Many other challenges, many other problems, but when they faced first Afghanistan and they realized that they brought in 88,000 Afghans in the course of 6 weeks, and we were there helping them figure out how do you receive that many people that quickly? And again, it was a crisis context, and they started to look at sponsorship as one tool to do that. They needed to mobilize the citizens of the United States, not only the professional agencies of the United States. The Uniting for Ukraine program followed directly on the Homes from Ukraine program, where they saw the potential of taking that model, which they had sort of flirted with in Afghanistan, and putting it under their program. It continues to be a shorter duration, and as Tim said, the specific responsibilities of sponsors are different. But that's the case in all of those 30 programs I mentioned. Every single one is tailored to a specific context, a specific national government, a specific problem they're trying to solve. The common thread is empowering communities, empowering NGOs, universities, employers, non-government actors, and empowering local hosts. And that is the part that I think has shifted significantly in the United States from the Syrian response, but also the 4 decades before Syria and where they are today, both in Afghanistan, Ukraine, and now I will say they've just launched something called Welcome Corps, which is, Nick, to your question, a permanent private sponsorship program. They've announced phase 1, it's launched and live, and phase 2 will be live by the end of this year. Highly motivated, including in the president's office, because of what they've seen succeed Uniting for Ukraine. And again, thanks to all of you, you inspired them with the success of Homes for Ukraine.
I just really quickly wanted to say that I happened to be in Poland in refugee centers, and actually just in the middle of everything what was going on, literally on the second day when war has started. And what I've seen, that there was a pure chaos. Basically, lots of buses going different direction, different countries. And as Nick mentioned, that I actually ended up helping one of those organizations kind of to find people for the bus going to somewhere north. And it was, looking back at that, I understand that this was really chaotic and really unsafe. We actually had, not the organization I was helping, but in Krakow, we actually had reported one bus just gone missing. No one knew when it went. And basically, the situation is, we've been working in refugee centers in Krakow and in general in Poland, so also in Warsaw. And what I see, and I spoke to a lot of people who actually returned from different countries, from Scandinavian countries, from Germany, from Italy, returned from that because they had like 2 months, 1 month support, and they actually felt even more helpless when they understood there is no future, basically. They didn't know where to go. There was absolutely no place where to go. And basically they were returning back to Poland, to refugee center, creating this really unnecessary traffic back and forth refugees. And back then, our main purpose was introducing the program to people, because it's frankly speaking, it was really hard to believe that it's true when we did that. A lot of Ukrainians just heard that, and it was really, really hard to believe and actually rely your life on that scheme and actually try out that. But while we were progressing more and more, we understood how advantageous actually was, like on the contrary of those crisis help that was organized in other countries when people actually just had to leave, went back to a refugee center in Poland. So it is really something absolutely different, and it was a major help.
And the public appetite for being part of these community-based welcome efforts is really extraordinary. So we first asked this question back in 2016, actually, in the middle of the Syrian refugee crisis, essentially asking, would you be interested in helping to host refugee through and participating in this idea of refugee sponsorship? And we found we did, I think it was 10 countries across Europe, US, and typically the number was about 10 to 15% of people said that they were interested, which you might say, if you think of it, that's not support for the scheme, that's participating in it. When with Ukraine, the numbers have increased really substantially. So it's roughly 1 in 4 in the US and the UK said I'd be interested. Now that doesn't mean opening up their homes, but if you think of that in practical terms, 1 in 4 adults is like 12 million Brits, and so that willingness. So we shouldn't think that we're all tapped out. There's 117,000 people being hosted. A lot of those hosts are tired. Many of them are saying I could really do with a break. And that's completely normal. But the part of where the next stage for this is to really think through the design, and part of my work has been how do you build social movements around different issues, and part of the trick is always making it easy on-ramps for people to get a little bit involved, without making everything really hard from the beginning, and getting people just familiar with the idea and developing their confidence that they can be helpful. One of the really interesting groups we just had in the US was a group of 20-somethings who'd all been involved in sponsorship. And they were really surprised because their feeling at the beginning was basically a bunch of friends who'd sort of come together. But their surprise was the most practical things that people were struggling with, Ukrainians in the US, was all the stuff that you have to do on the internet. So it's kind of enrolling in, finding housing and getting the dentist sorted and the doctor and getting the kids into school and where do you find a uniform and all the things, exactly the same issues that people have been battling here. And a lot of that, actually older folks who are retired, whatever, aren't so good because it's all kind of, in a digital age, it's all how do you navigate these systems. One of the things they all said was wow, it's so much harder living in America than what we thought when you accompany a newcomer. But they also had this story of, wow, we're really surprised how we could be helpful. And that thing of people just experiencing that they can help another human being in really tangible ways is a really powerful motivator. So that's why Lily's video, that showing that stuff is really important. The stories of hosts is a powerful motivator to bring in the next wave and the next wave. And I think we are even though, you know, this has been a very big scheme very quickly, in the medium term, there's a lot more people who could come on board. We need to think a lot more about how to structure these programs and get groups rather than relying so intensely on individual families. And I think there's just, you know, there are lots of ways in which this can grow, and thinking of little ways in which people can just have a toe in the water and you know, just do something small, because often by getting a little bit involved, they want to get more involved.
So I'm going to have just Richard, and then I'm going to turn it over to the floor. But
just quickly, one of the problems with the Ukrainians, let's call it the unit size of family, was typically 3 people, 2 or 3 people. So people with 1 spare room or 2 spare rooms, a lot of people were in that category. The problem we've found with other cohorts, the Syrians and Afghans, for example, is a lot of them have 6 or 7 people. Now, you can be the nicest people in the world. You can be wanting to host people, but most normal-sized apartments and houses in this country, let alone with the spare capacity, were just not made for that. So these sponsorship schemes are not suitable for all. And that's, the whole thing we have to bear in mind. And they're not suitable, for example, if we start taking people in just on the grounds of vulnerability, which I hope we will in other schemes. It does not mean, unfortunately, some people are vulnerable, are disabled, have, not just physical, but mental problems as well, which means that bringing into somebody's house or apartment is not appropriate. So it's not the only answer, but it is one of the main answers. Thank you.
I agree. So I'm going to turn it over to the floor, but before I do that, I'm going to ask you to ask questions and not make statements, with one exception. So Paul Morrison is here, and he is the man who, civil servant who ran this scheme, and I owe him a duty, I owe him a debt in a sense, because it would have been perfectly reasonable when I rang him or somehow contacted him about a year ago to say, why do I want to talk to you? You know nothing about this, but he absolutely didn't. And he was very generous with his time. And so I'm going to take questions, but I'm also going to ask Paul if he wants to add anything to this. Because
Nick, excuse me, may I make a suggestion? I unfortunately have to go now because I have to do a speech a bit later. And Paul could come here. He's much better than I am. I normally just take the credit. I take the credit for what he does anyway. But thank you very much, everybody.
No, thank you, Richard.
I thought I was getting a free dinner.
We thought we'd ambush you, Paul.
Our statement, Howard. So, the one thing I would say, there are a number of colleagues in this room, and actually I say colleagues, a lot of civil servants in the room, and a lot of other people from all the different sectors. And the key to this is certainly not any individual. And I think one of the things that I'd like to say as a statement that is really important in the leadership of this is you can't lead these kind of schemes without humility. Because the reason why I think it was successful is because we 100% did not know the answers. So that was why I was so keen to talk to you, Nick, and others, because, and in fact the way we set up the scheme was because we have direct experience of government schemes, and I've worked on many of them and led them and been responsible for those failures, where we've sat in our ivory tower and tried to construct something perfectly in these big machines, and it lacked the human element. They are just ineffective and inefficient. So I'm just saying humility is important, and I'm slightly embarrassed about the number of times my name was checked because there are so many other people who were the reason why this was successful.
No, I mean, I fully understand that. And I should say, over the last year, we've had astonishing engagement with a very wide and numerous number of people who've worked with you in different departments, and to a person, they've been completely fantastic. If you'd said to me that somebody like me could engage really fruitfully with the civil servants or with government, which I had no experience of, I wouldn't have believed you. And we absolutely have, and they're very, very talented people. Over to you, the floor, and direct the questions not to me, but anywhere else you like.
Thank you. I wonder if after a year of this crisis going on, there is a war fatigue, and are you struggling to find generosity and accommodations for the refugees who are still here or the new displaced people that want to come?
I'm gonna start it. You can. Well, basically, the situation is actually much more complex because we have the situation when people agree to stay, agreed between each other, between the Ukrainian guest and the sponsor, that they're gonna stay there like for 6 months, for a year, to up to 2 years, and some people withdraw from the scheme, and some people encourage other people. So basically, there is definitely a less kind of on the news, definitely, and but it's still, there is still people who apply, and there is still people who are hearing from that. We have people who already hosted before, and they're trying to do it again. We actually had people who, unfortunately, had maybe not that successful match, but they wanted to do it with other people. So basically, making for them, for host, to do that in more easy and transparent way, exactly what we're trying to do as organization, to give them help, to guide them through the process. Helping them with that actually encourage more people, and well, hopefully we will get more people in that. There is definitely some decreasing, but it's still on. There is still people interested.
Hi, sorry, I already have the mic. So from your perspectives, how can community leaders, the people who are running community organizations, people who have lived experience of being from a refugee background, how can these particular groups be involved within the implementation and within the development of these schemes? From like your perspectives, what are your suggestions or recommendations in how that can essentially happen?
I think there's two big opportunities right now here in the UK. The first is you continue to have an uncapped, by that we mean there's no limit on the number of people who can come. It's unusual for governments to open uncapped schemes. And you have an ongoing uncapped sponsorship scheme operating in the country. The more people who engage in that scheme, the better. As you've heard, there's still lots of people who want to come. So I think there's an opportunity for organizations to get involved. You can learn from other organizations who are already involved, work together, partner, be inspired, and find your own way to contribute and really, support hosts, find hosts. There's lots of roles for civil society in this moment, in this scheme. So that's thing one. And thing two, which I think we've sort of been hinting at and pointing to in different ways, but this is a really exciting opportunity to take this program that has been so successful and widely supported here and figure out what is the next step. And I think that's where we really need a lot of voices, different kinds of advocacy, different types of channels, people with lived experience talking about the impact of these programs on their lives, the potential for family reunification, extended links, universities talking about the fact that these two-sided visa programs allow them to innovate and do what they do best. Go find some students and bring in students and offer them support on campuses. All of this is facilitated by these empowering sponsorship programs. You've got a pilot program here that's big and scaled and successful. This is the moment for civil society, private sector, universities, others to really be pushing to extend that program, expand the program to new populations, make it permanent, do whatever comes next. So I encourage you to collectively think about what comes next and figure out what your plan of action is to engage and push for that next step.
From my perspective as a bureaucrat in receipt of some of the advocacy that will happen, one of the things that makes it really easy for us to adopt stuff is less kind of suggestions in the abstract, like expand the scheme, extend the scheme. If you can come with this is my lived experience, here's a really clear suggestion, then people love that, because then you can really engage with something tangible. So a lot of the examples, Nick, I'd pay tribute to you and Citizens UK, the conversations I was having with all of you right at the outset, that's why it was such a delight to work with you, because I was basically getting PowerPoint presentations with, right, this is how we're going to do it. So all I had to then do is go, right, yeah, one of those, please. And it was so much easier for me to sell back in the department because it wasn't abstract, it was really tangible. So the more that you can translate some of the experience that you've got into some really practical suggestions, I should say both central government, local government, all the different, it isn't just, as Jen is kind of saying, there are lots of opportunities to get involved right across the country.
I mean, I think this is what we're seeing is we are building a community-based movement that is like any other movement. I mean, we often think of movements as things that kind of, people march down the streets and demand things from government. But this is something broader. It's about creating an ecosystem which requires, in Canada, for example, there's all sorts of specialist organisations. There's all kinds of aspects of how you do this really well. You need people with communications expertise. You need people who are good on the recruitment thing. You need people who can create videos, and all of this needs to be really informed by the experience of people who themselves have been welcomed, and they can reflect on the things that are most valuable. But I think that we're at this early stage of building something that, as Paul said at the beginning, it's big movements of people are not going to stop. We're going to see, we've had in less than 10 years 3 major movements, people movements from Syria, Afghanistan and Ukraine. Inevitably, climate is going to see a lot more displacement of people. And one of the things that I know from my work more broadly on how do you counter the rise of authoritarians and populism is you need to turn down people's anxiety and fear about the future. This is really important, what we're doing in building community-based welcome for refugees, because there's a lot of anxiety about those movements of people. Reassuring people that it's actually entirely possible for a country like the UK to absorb really large numbers of people successfully and have all these positive stories, actually. That's going to be really important, because we are going to have more crises that see big movements of people. Others will want to come along and make a lot of fear and in those moments, and being able to, having hundreds of thousands of people who've been part of this experience, or even millions in coming years, who can say, this is not something to be so anxious about. We can cope. As Angela Merkel said, wir schaffen das. We can do this. Back in 2015, 2016, when Germany took in more than 1 million Syrians, that message becomes really important. So this is, where we're at the beginning of something that is going to be really important for the future.
Right, we can take one more question, and then I think we're done.
I got 2 questions. Is that okay? First of all, thank the panelists for your insights. And I got 2 questions, mainly aimed at Ms. Anastasia. And the first one is that, do you think there's anything more the UK government can do to help the USP UK program to be even better? And secondly is that, based on your experience, what advice would you give to fellow Ukrainians who's going to arrive into the UK to help them settle in the UK? And is there anything the host can do to help?
Actually, it's really interesting. So the first question what you asked was about kind of improvement of the USPK and our work in general, and basically what we're trying to do, the core kind of essential of our work, it's basically bringing more people here and recruiting of more and more hosts, and kind of encouraging people to speak about advantage of this, and kind of encouraging them to participate in this program and speak in this kind of event, or maybe in your local event, in local communities event, about there is people who can explain you, guide you through the process. They can help you to get to the point where you can be absolutely sure that you have a support to actually help person to get to the UK. So basically, that would be my giveaway here. Just to speak more about that, speak that you're not alone. When you host, we are here to kind of guide you, to help you to get through any obstacles or kind of question you might have. And so, can you repeat the second one?
Based on your experience, what advice would you give to fellow Ukrainians who's going to arrive into the UK to help them settle in the UK? And if there's anything the sponsor or the host can do to help them?
Well, definitely, yeah. So it is a process between both kind of side and applicants, so like Ukrainian guest and host or sponsor, to find that balance between the dynamic that could happen in the house, kind of find that balance when each side have their own private space and own and respect their kind of independence. I would really think it's actually really connected to previous question. What I wanted to say that what people, leaders of communities can do is actually like not only recruit more of the hosts, but also help Ukrainian who already here to integrate into society, basically helping with the job, with, for example, most of the people who arrived here is a woman with kids, so basically helping them with childcare, with all of this really hard question, because if you woman with kids, when you have to work, right, and what you're going to do, what are you going to leave your kids, basically all of these questions, they are not a crisis support where we usually think about helping refugees. It's like find the accommodation, right? But these are more questions about being integrated into society, and what both sides and Ukrainians and sponsor can do. It's actually be as open as possible to build the relationship, kind of the understand how people live here and understand each other kind of outbringings. If anyone wants to add anything.
No, it's very good. I'm going to... No. Okay, one more.
Thank you so much. My name is Dylan, and I'm the son of a combination of refugees, so I'm particularly inspired by you and saved by your courageous leadership.
So, do you want to... I can't hear it.
Sorry.
I keep losing these, so...
I was saying that I'm particularly inspired by Anastasia and the courageous leadership and resilience you've demonstrated. My question is on the subject of mental health and the sort of trauma and loss that many displaced people experience. I just wonder what your thoughts are on how we improve access to mental health resources, how we reduce the stigma around it in order to make sure that displaced people are as safe and secure as possible.
It's actually a really, really great question. Talking about mental health, what we can see as a biggest barrier and kind of obstacle to actually help Ukrainian in this kind of absolutely heartbreaking situation is the language. Basically, what we can see that language is usually well, there is an opportunity for Ukrainians. There is actually some initiative in the UK who wants to help, but they usually either English speaking or Russian speaking. And I personally have a conversation. One of the Ukrainians who came here was sponsored to come here to the UK, and this person has just refused to speak Russian. So basically, she wanted to get the mental health kind of help, but couldn't because the language barrier. I would say it's also connected to the integration. We need to. It's so essential to help people to be able to speak them for themselves, to kind of have their own voice, to be able to represent their thoughts and ideas, and basically that's how you help in mental kind of area or mental health area, and let person speak. And different sort of initiative when Ukrainians, what I also saw that Ukrainians who already came here gathered together to build this kind of close initiative to help other Ukrainians. But it's all really small. It needs support from the people who are already here, who already know how it works. So I would say English barrier to overcome, and second is kind of to actually help this Ukrainian initiative to grow up, because the feeling with the people who came from the same, it's basically when the trauma was invented. I mean, when we're talking about psychological term, as trauma actually was discovered after the Second World War, when people start gathering together and speaking about the experience they've been through, and how they what kind of impact it has on their mental health. And they were not specialists, they were just people who went through the same thing, and they gathered together and been speaking through it, and then they understood that actually it helps. And basically on kind of this idea we can also build it further.
Thank you.
Good, thank you, Nastya. You can see why you want Nastya on your team. Before I close, I just want to acknowledge also that we've talked a bit about USP UK, but the integration bit is the absolutely critical bit. And USP UK formed a partnership with Citizens UK, and we have Laura and Jonathan, who I need to acknowledge very importantly that it is a partnership between us and them, and they are absolutely fundamentally important to what we do. And indeed, Anastasia actually works for our joint venture. I want to thank all our panelists. You've been inspiring and deeply knowledgeable, and I hope that's been enlightening for those of you who've been here. Thank you for coming, and we'll close it there. Thank you.